Some stories in Hollywood are never really finished. They simply fade into silence, waiting for the right moment to be told. When news broke that Diane Keaton had died on 11th October 2025, the world paused. It wasn't just the loss of an actress. It was the quiet extinguishing of a light that had colored decades of cinema with intelligence, humor, and grace. But then came a whisper that turned grief into stunned reflection. After 40 years of silence, Al Pacino, her co-star, confidant, and once secret love, finally spoke. His words were not rehearsed lines from a script, but something raw, unguarded, and heartbreakingly human. "You're a great artist. I love you forever." Behind those few sentences lay an untold story, one of passion, distance, and the invisible thread that bound two of Hollywood's most complex souls. It wasn't the glamorous tale of red carpets and premieres, but of two people who, beneath the spotlight, were learning how to live, to love, and to lose. Pacino's confession, unearthed in his recent memoir Sonny Boy, is more than a revelation. It's a reckoning, a man's late attempt to make peace with the woman who shaped his art, his silence, and perhaps his heart. Stay with us as we trace the journey behind that quiet declaration. From the first sparks on The Godfather set to the final farewell that redefined what it means to love without holding on. For Al Pacino's words to hold such weight, one must first understand the woman they were meant for. Diane Keaton was never just another Hollywood name. She was a quiet revolution in a wide-brimmed hat. Over 6 decades, her career shaped the contours of modern American cinema. The Godfather introduced her as the gentle heart in a brutal world. Kay Adams, the only light in Michael Corleone's darkness. Then came Annie Hall in 1977, a role so disarmingly natural it seemed less like acting and more like breathing. Her playful awkwardness, sharp wit, and unstudied elegance earned her an Academy Award and defined an era. In later years, Something's Gotta Give proved that age could be neither a burden nor a boundary. Keaton made middle-aged vulnerability look fearless, funny, and utterly alive. Beyond her performances, she redefined what it meant to be a woman in Hollywood. Where others bent to expectation, she built her own silhouette. Tailored suits, loose ties, crisp shirts, and an unapologetic individuality that became her signature. Her humor was sharp, her honesty disarming, her independence quiet but unwavering. She spoke of never wanting to be perfect, only to be real. And in that simple truth lay her power. Perhaps that was what Al Pacino saw and never forgot. A woman who refused to be molded, whose authenticity made her both impossible to possess and impossible to forget. And as their paths crossed in the flickering light of The Godfather, what began as professional chemistry would soon evolve into something deeper, a connection that blurred the lines between art and life. Every story has its first glance, and theirs began beneath the hazy lights of an audition room. It was the early 1970s, when Hollywood was shaking off its golden polish and searching for something truer. Francis Ford Coppola, still in his 30s, was casting The Godfather and saw in Al Pacino a brooding silence that unsettled studio executives. They thought him too short, too obscure. Coppola insisted there was a danger in his stillness that would define Michael Corleone. For Kay Adams, he wanted the opposite, light to Al's shadow. When Diane Keaton entered the room, bright-eyed and unpretentious, Coppola wrote in his notebook, "She looks as though she doesn't belong to the mafia world. That's exactly why she must." The audition was intimate, almost awkward. Two strangers asked to play love on command. Pacino said little, exhaled smoke, and simply looked at her, a look that spoke volumes. "He barely talked," Keaton recalled later, "and that's what drew me in." In that silence, something unspoken took root, a curiosity that would survive decades. When filming began, the chemistry was undeniable. He was the storm beneath the surface. She was the breeze that softened it. Coppola later said that when the camera rolled, they didn't act, they became. Few could have guessed that what started as a screen test would become a lifelong entanglement of art, affection, and regret. As The Godfather reached the world, it changed everything. The film made Al Pacino a reluctant star, and Diane Keaton a name audiences would never forget. Amid the frenzy of premieres and interviews, they remained curiously private, orbiting one another with the discretion of two people who knew fame could shatter fragile things. Those who worked with them described a quiet connection, Shared laughter between takes, long silences no one dared interrupt. For Diane, Al's intensity was magnetic. For Al, her warmth was disarming. They balanced each other like light and shade on the same canvas. Their relationship deepened after The Godfather Part 2, when the cinematic partnership turned personal. They dined in small restaurants, avoiding the Hollywood glitter. To outsiders, they were opposites. She, open and quick to laugh. He, inward and unreadable. Yet that contrast seemed to sustain them. Keaton once summed it up in a single rueful line: "Love of my life, but we're complicated." By the late 1970s, both were ascendant. Keaton won an Oscar for Annie Hall, a performance that embodied everything new and modern about women on screen, while Pacino was redefining masculinity through roles of torment and rebellion. Success, however, can be a cruel companion. Their schedules diverged. Their lives became sets they rarely shared. Still, between them lingered a loyalty, a mutual recognition of the only other person who truly understood what sudden greatness cost. They were never showy, never staged. Friends would later recall seeing them together, heads bowed over dinner, speaking in low tones as though the world around them were irrelevant. It was a love lived in half-light, beautiful precisely because it refused to announce itself. With the arrival of the 1980s, the rhythm changed. Keaton thrived in independent projects, exploring complex female characters with humor and grace. Pacino retreated deeper into the craft, chasing roles that consumed him. She loved conversation, friends, the sunlit openness of Los Angeles. He preferred the solitude of New York theater. The divergence was slow but relentless. When they met, they were young actors finding themselves. Now they were icons defending their solitude. Keaton, ever candid, spoke of wanting stability. Pacino, haunted by the fear of being trapped, avoided the word marriage, like a line he couldn't deliver. He couldn't commit, she later admitted, and I couldn't keep waiting. Their private farewell came years before The Godfather Part 3, but the film would become a mirror held to their history. Coppola reunited the original cast to close the saga, and both agreed, cautiously, to return. On set, the atmosphere was heavy with things unsaid. In one of their final scenes, Michael looks at Kay, the woman he has lost but can never release, and she looks back, eyes steady, resigned. Coppola later revealed, "No one spoke after we shot it. They weren't acting anymore." That gaze carried all the weight of 2 decades, love unfulfilled, promises unspoken, and the knowledge that some endings are permanent. After filming wrapped in 1990, they walked away in silence. Keaton would later write, "I told him if he didn't want to marry me, I was leaving. And I did." It was not an impulsive decision, but the inevitable close of a long, beautiful ache. Even so, there was no bitterness between them. She called him a mystery I will never solve. He, in rare moments of candor, called her the one who saw me before I saw myself. They had stopped being lovers, but they remained part of each other's legend, a pair forever entwined in the collective imagination, where Michael and Kay still stand facing one another in eternal, cinematic distance. Years later, when interviews turned nostalgic, both spoke of that reunion as if it belonged to another life. Keaton described it as complicated but necessary. Pacino, typically reserved, said only, "It was good to see her." Yet those who watched closely could sense what words withheld, a lingering tenderness wrapped in regret. Their performances in The Godfather Part 3 transcended fiction. The pain in Michael's eyes, the quiet dignity in Kay's, felt too honest to be imagined. Coppola himself admitted that he hardly directed those scenes. He simply let the camera witness 2 people saying goodbye. After the film, their lives diverged completely. Keaton chose calm over chaos, motherhood over endless ambition. Pacino continued to work, his fame undimmed, but his solitude deepened. They rarely met again, yet their connection endured like the echo of a song that never quite ends. When Pacino finally wrote about her in Sonny Boy decades later, the memory was still tender. "We found a tempo and a temperature that was right," he wrote, a line that seemed to close the circle they had begun all those years before. What remained between them was not a love story in the ordinary sense, but something quieter, a shared understanding carved from art, loss, and time. As film historians often note, The Godfather gave the world an unforgettable couple on screen, but what lay behind it was even rarer: 2 souls who met once, completely, and spent the rest of their lives learning how to let go. In the years that followed their silent parting, both Diane Keaton and Al Pacino seemed to step out of the blinding light of romance and into a gentler, more private kind of life. What had once burned brightly between them softened into something steadier, affection without possession, memory without pain. For Diane, the years after The Godfather Part 3 marked a quiet turning point. She began choosing roles that reflected her own evolution, lighter, wittier, but still rooted in emotional truth. Films such as Baby Boom and Something's Gotta Give allowed her to show that joy and wisdom could coexist, that women over 50 could be complex, radiant, and free. Off-screen, she found fulfillment not through another marriage, but through motherhood. She adopted 2 children, Dexter and Duke, raising them with the warmth and candor that had always defined her. Her home in Los Angeles became her sanctuary, filled with books, vintage furniture, and laughter. She wore her quirks proudly, still favoring the wide-brimmed hats and monochrome suits that had once scandalized stylists. She lived without regret. "I've had my great love," she once said, "and I've had my life. I wouldn't trade either." Al Pacino, by contrast, remained a restless spirit. His career continued in waves, Shakespearean revivals, new film roles, and late accolades that confirmed his place among cinema's titans. He had children with different partners but never married, as though some part of him had accepted that intimacy came with its own cost. In interviews, he often joked about solitude, yet his words carried an undertone of wistfulness. "I've loved deeply," he once said, "but I was never good at keeping love." Still, time softened them both. Though they led separate lives, there were quiet moments when their paths seemed to cross again. Award ceremonies, tributes, or the occasional public event where one would mention the other with a smile that spoke volumes. When Keaton released her memoir Then Again, Pacino was among the first to send her flowers. And when he turned 80, she called him, simply to say she was proud. It was as if some invisible thread still connected them, unbroken by distance or age. Not a romantic bond, but something deeper. Recognition, gratitude, and the comfort of having shared something that shaped them both. Their story, stripped of glamour, carries a truth rarely told in Hollywood, that love need not last to be real. Some affections, once lived honestly, remain intact even after the people who shared them walk separate paths. For Keaton and Pacino, love had evolved into a quiet understanding that neither fame nor time could undo. In the end, their greatest lesson may be this: real love doesn't always mean staying. Sometimes it means letting go and remembering well. As the years slipped into their final act, Al Pacino turned inward. For decades, he had avoided the public confessional, guarding his private life as fiercely as he guarded his performances. Yet in 2024, at the age of 84, he did something no one expected. He wrote. The memoir, simply titled Sonny Boy, was not the flamboyant chronicle of a Hollywood legend. Instead, it was a quiet reckoning, an artist looking back at the ruins and splendor of his own existence. Critics described it as a man speaking without the armor of myth. In its pages, there were no grand declarations, no rehearsed anecdotes, only honesty. And among those pages, there was her. Diane Keaton appeared not as a chapter heading, but as a current running through the entire book. Unnamed at first, then spoken aloud with rare tenderness. She helped me through my ruins when I could barely stand, he wrote. She pushed me when I wanted to disappear. She believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. The line struck readers like a quiet revelation. For those who had followed their intertwined histories for half a century, this was not just nostalgia. It was confession. Later, another passage surfaced, one that critics and fans alike quoted endlessly. We got drunk together after the Godfather shoots, and I knew then I'd never meet anyone like her again. It was simple, almost throwaway in tone, yet it carried the weight of everything he had left unsaid. For 40 years, Pacino had remained silent about the depth of that bond, a silence born perhaps of pride, perhaps of pain. But here, in print, there was no performance, no mask, only truth. Those who knew him said that writing Sonny Boy changed him. The process forced him to look directly at the ghosts of his past, fame, failure, and the faces he'd loved and lost. For the first time, he seemed at peace with the idea that his life had been shaped as much by what he couldn't hold on to as by what he achieved. In one of the most quoted passages, he wrote, "There are people who never leave you. They live in the pauses between things. She was one of them. Readers knew exactly who he meant. When the memoir was released, critics hailed it as the most unguarded work of Pacino's career, not because of what it revealed about Hollywood, but because of what it revealed about him. In those quiet admissions about Diane, there was both a declaration of love and an apology too late to be heard. Many saw Sonny Boy as more than an autobiography. It was a reconciliation with the past. If Diane had always embodied truth, a woman who refused to hide behind glamour or expectation, then Al, in contrast, had embodied solitude, the artist burdened by intensity, by the weight of his own silences. In writing about her, he seemed to bridge that divide at last. When news of Diane Keaton's death broke in October 2025, Sonny Boy resurfaced everywhere. Passages about her flooded social media, printed beside black and white stills of The Godfather and Annie Hall. To many, those words now read not as memoir, but as a eulogy written in advance, the farewell of a man who had never quite managed to say goodbye. He did not issue a long statement to the press, only a few words released through his publicist. She was the soul of Kay Corleone. I loved her. And that was all. Yet the book remained, the one space where he had finally spoken without restraint. In its closing chapter, Pacino wrote, I used to think love was something you acted. Now I know it's something you remember. It was perhaps his last performance. Not on screen, but on the page where he could finally tell the truth. Through Sonny Boy, Al Pacino gave the world the confession he had carried for half a lifetime, that the woman he never married had been, in every sense, his great love. And in doing so, he gave Diane Keaton and himself the peace that words at last could bring. When the lights fade and the credits roll, what remains is not fame or fortune, but the small, enduring truths two people leave behind. For Diane Keaton and Al Pacino, that truth was never written in marriage certificates or red carpet photographs. It lived instead in glances, in silences, and in the art they created together. Diane's legacy stretches far beyond the roles that made her famous. She changed the way audiences saw women, not as ideals to be pursued, but as individuals to be understood. Through Annie Hall, Something's Gotta Give, and Marvin's Room, she redefined femininity as a blend of wit, vulnerability, and courage. Her refusal to conform, in fashion, in career, in love, became its own quiet revolution. She showed that authenticity was a form of strength, that imperfection could be luminous. Al Pacino's legacy, by contrast, lies in his relentless pursuit of emotional truth. From The Godfather to Scent of a Woman, he taught generations that intensity could coexist with fragility, that silence could be more powerful than rage. If Diane's gift was to illuminate, his was to reveal. Both searching, both unafraid, together they represented two halves of the same truth, the need to live honestly, even when honesty costs you comfort. After Diane's passing, those who revisited Sonny Boy found something quietly redemptive in its pages. It was as though, by finally speaking her name, Al had closed a circle that had remained open for half a century. Love, once lost, had been returned to memory, and memory, in turn, had become its own kind of immortality. Their story is not a tragedy, but a lesson in what endures. Some loves do not ask to last forever. They ask only to be remembered well. And, perhaps, that is the truest kind of devotion. Not the promise to stay, but the grace to let time keep what we could not. In the end, Diane Keaton and Al Pacino gave us more than films. They gave us proof that art, like love, matters most when it tells the truth. The love between Diane Keaton and Al Pacino stands as quiet proof that a love need not be complete to be true. It reminds us that some connections are not meant to end in permanence, but in understanding, the kind that outlives time, distance, and even death. Their art was the vessel for that emotion. Every role they inhabited, she as the honest dreamer, he as the haunted soul, carried fragments of who they really were. For them, acting was never pretense. It was confession. And perhaps the most enduring confession of all lies in that final scene of The Godfather Part 3, Michael's gaze toward Kay. It was not the look of an actor at his co-star, but of a man who knows he has lost something irreplaceable, a look both silent and eternal. It is there in that lingering frame that their story lives on, where love, regret, and art become indistinguishable. What do you think? Can love still be real if it doesn't last forever? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more timeless stories of cinema, passion, and truth.